Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the second London International Conference. In my capacity of the organizing committee member, my name is Diana Pak, and I'm a senior English language lecturer at KIMEP University, that is based in Kazakhstan. And in the next 3 days, we will be building a discussion, networking, and publishing platform for the researchers across various disciplines and countries. A few days ago, we asked you to introduce yourself on a networking board to foster fruitful academic collaboration. Unfortunately, very few people actually did it. So I will share a link one more time in the chat box, and we ask you to spend a few minutes to introduce yourselves to other researchers who would like to build their network. And we all will need to follow a few guidelines to help the conference run smoothly. So please keep your microphones muted unless you need to speak. If possible, please turn your cameras on to bring more human touch into our digital space. And do not hesitate to ask your questions or share your comments in the chat box. This will help the conference become a truly interactive and lively event. Thank you. And now let me give the floor, or probably I should say screen, to the founder of the conference, Dr. Selim. He is also the owner and the director of UKEY Consulting and Publishing Company. Dr. Selim, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Greetings, everyone from England. We held our previous conference in January. It was even more successful than expected. We met over 3 days, joined by 50 participants from around 20 countries. We have shared the sessions on YouTube and published the proceedings. We published the works of those who attended the conference with a full paper in the journal. We have published the conference articles as both electronic books and hard copies on Amazon. We would like to thank the Academic Studies English and Russian WhatsApp groups that we created last month for your interest. We continue to communicate with more than 100 researchers, academics, journalists, and students in group. We can share the links for those who want to participate. We announced that this conference would be different from the previous conference. For this conference, 9 new countries, such as Australia, Austria, Azerbaijan, Bosnia, Czechia, Egypt, Germany, Indonesia, and South Africa have also joined our network. We honored to be joined by our 2 highly esteemed keynote speakers, Dr. Brent. He is from Westcliff University, California, United States of America. Thank you to Dr. Brent. And doctoral researcher, Ms. Sophia. She is from Birmingham University, United Kingdom. Thank you to Ms. Butt. We are sharing this conference in Clubhouse, free of charge. You may access Clubhouse at conference program schedule. I wish success to all the conference participants. Good luck and welcome everyone to the April London International Conference. Thank you very much. Diana?
Thank you, Dr. Selim. And we have another committee, organizing committee member here with us, Erin.
Hello, welcome everyone. Yeah, my name's Erin. and I'm an undergraduate at the University of Sheffield. I came to the first conference back in January and was very impressed, so I'm very excited to be here again, and everyone has a lot to look forward to. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, let's proceed and invite today's first keynote speaker, Professor Brent Davis from Westcliff University, US. Professor Davis is the author of a textbook in phonetics for English language teachers that I personally read when I was doing my bachelor degree, and I had this great opportunity to take this course from him. He specializes in second language acquisition. So please, dear participants, share. You can leave your questions and comments that you'd like to address to Dr. Davis in the chat box. Professor Davis, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana. Yes, she was a great student, and I know she's a great teacher now, so I would like to take her class if I get a chance. So, so nice to see all of you, and I wish we could be together in person, but I guess the good point is I get to do this from my room instead of traveling on a very crowded airplane for hours and hours. So that's the good thing. So our topic today is educating for the new normal. And I would like to thank Professor Ozdemir and the organizing committee for this opportunity. And so great to see those of you I knew before that we have crossed paths, such as Professor Butt. Good to see you again, and other colleagues. All right. Well, so my remarks will be brief, but if you will put my contact information in the chat later if you have questions or just want to discuss things, that would be great. So we are all looking forward to a hopefully better new normal, but what I would like to share with you today is my findings as I have thought about how can I prepare myself for educating in these changing times. And I think the main thing that perhaps we can all agree on is that normal changes. Normal is not a fixed, static location. If we look back in history, it seems like there were long periods of time where there weren't big changes. Changes were gradual. It was easy to adjust, but it seems the pace of change is rather rapid. And so let's talk about the types of normal. Let me see if I can present. One of the researchers I looked at, David Snowden, developed a framework for describing different types of situations. And this framework he calls Cynefin, which is a Welsh word. And so that's a bit dear to me since I have Welsh ancestors. But in this framework, there are 4 quadrants, which I will show you in a moment. And these 4 quadrants are go from simple to complicated to complex to chaotic. And as we begin with a simple situation, we can see that in a simple situation, there are simple rules that we can follow. For example, something like love your neighbor. That's a great one. And we can realize that this is a situation where things don't change radically. We will probably always have neighbors. They will probably always need our love. And perhaps you recognize this as a command from the Bible, and for those of you who are believers, that would be a note to that. All right. Now, can you see educating in the new normal?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm going to try to make this larger. Okay. And so just to step back a moment, what is normal? You know, we're used to the normal curve, something, but we talked about that. What is education? Is it just simply pouring things into people's heads? All right, and here we have the KIMEP model: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. So in the simple, as we said, we can just have something like love your neighbor. We always have neighbors. They always need love. This is pleasing to God. Complicated. Now, here I have made a few changes from what I read in KIMEP to reflect some ideas from Atul Gawande in his book, The Checklist Manifesto. So a complicated situation requires a checklist, and Gawande gives an example of I believe it was one of the early 4-engine aircraft commissioned by the Army back in the 1930s. And in its first test flight, the experienced pilot crashed the plane because he forgot one of several things that needed to be done. And the result of the commission's report was that their pilots need a checklist. And this allows for important steps or considerations to not be easily overlooked. Again, although things are complicated, the situation doesn't change. And so this checklist, this procedure is useful over a period of time. Now, when things become complex, we require a system model to guide planning. Inputs and outputs are connected by feedback loops, which may be nonlinear, so changes. So it can be difficult to predict the consequences of interventions because there are multiple interactions. And there is a constant change, but there's maybe periodicity. So there's some kind of stability. When we get to chaotic, what we need here is action and evaluation, because this situation is not stable. Small changes can lead to very different outcomes, which is called the butterfly effect. And so we have to work with short-term goals in such a situation. All right, and as you can imagine, the monitoring and communication load increases as we go around the square from simple to chaotic. As always, measuring the right thing is a key to meeting meaningful goals. Planning becomes more difficult and begins to require skills like super forecasting and red teaming, which you can find out more about from sources in the bibliography. So a changing normal requires a changing educational institution, a learning organization. Now, Education. So we've talked about the new normal, which probably is not going to stay consistent, where it's probably going to be more complex. And because of that, we need an organization that's able to adapt, an adaptive organization. But what is the role? What is the goal of education? And I would like to propose the goal of shalom. Shalom is a word that again comes out of the Bible, and it represents the idea of well-being or peace, that people are free and have no unmet needs. And another way to look at is blessing. And I know many of us try to follow the God of Abraham. So we can start by looking at Abraham's blessing. And he was told to go, to be blessed, and that through his descendants, all nations would be blessed. He would be the source of blessing. And we then see that this idea is later picked up by Jesus when he gives a command to his disciples to go into the world, make disciples, and of all nations. And so, again, remember that he simplified or summarized the commands as love God and love your neighbor. And so we can see from this that the key to blessing, the key to shalom begins with education. We need to have these proper commands in mind in order to meet it. We can see many aspirational statements of people, different nations, talking about their desire for what we could call shalom. In the Declaration of Independence, there's a desire for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. Later in the 20th century, we come to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the four freedoms, which are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear, which are enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I could ask you to reflect a little bit, what is your shalom? So the Shalom Directed Learning Organization then works for the good of all. We talk about teacher-centered or learner-centered, but I would like us to think about community-centered learning. In other words, the benefit of the community is what we're working for. And since we are, as a learning organization, part of the community, we also have a desire for shalom. And so we need to empower teachers and learners because that helps all of us to have this peace and well-being. Again, we want to measure this, but we want to make sure we're measuring the right outcomes. And again, because we are dealing with complex problems, more likely than not, we need a team approach because all of us are smarter than one of us. We have strengths and weaknesses that can help each other. And a part of that is that we have different perspectives. We represent in this group many different languages, cultures, perhaps disciplines. And as a result, if we had a period of dialogue and asked each other the right questions, we would be able to come up with optimal solutions for our learning organization. So let's dialogue about educating in the new normal. Here are a few questions to think about. starting with what questions do we need to ask? What does shalom look like? How can we make a plan for education? Do we need fast thinking or slow thinking? So fast thinking relies on intuition. Slow thinking is scientific and going through logical process to get to insights. How can we better build a learning organization? What does community-centered learning look like? What other questions should we be asking? So I hope that this very brief sharing has given you some ideas to discuss and dialogue with those around you about the new normal, what it might look like, and then how can we form a learning organization that is adaptive and empowers people and results in shalom, in well-being for the community. And I should also like to point out in closing that this word shalom is related to the word Selim, as in the name of our distinguished organizer. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davis. Can I be first, Dr. Davis? What is your shalom?
What is my shalom? That is a great question. My shalom is to know that the people I'm working with have their needs met, that I would also, as you may have guessed, want to also have a right relationship with God as best I can understand it, and to be in right relationship with the people around me, starting with my wife and children, but going out to the greater community. And so if those areas, if my relationships are good, then and I suppose it's also nice if I have some food on the table. That's also great too. But and a few books. I need a few books. That's my shalom.
Thank you very much. That sounds really good.
Hi, Brent. It's Sophia here. Nice to see you again. And hello to everybody else.
Nice to see you. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I've got a question about the community learning in the situation of mental health. A lot of people today are experiencing quite a few problems as a direct consequence of the pandemic. And how does this work, in your opinion, in the sense that there are people who would need the support from the community or would need to give support to the community, and yet there are many people in these cocoons battling issues related to emotional and mental well-being at the moment. How do we kind of transcend that, and how do we kind of get to the community learning approach to support one another under these very difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in?
Right. That is an excellent question. Yes, many people, at points in our lives, we all need support. We began as babies who really don't contribute a lot to the world except to make us happy by being there. But those of us who, when we are in a period of depression or our minds are not functioning correctly, we really, really need this support. In extreme cases, I think we have to just do our best. In certain cases, people get locked into thought patterns, which sometimes and certain neurochemical levels are set that can be altered with drugs or other therapy. But I think that if they're not too deeply gone. Just the fact that we are supportive, that we are showing love. How can we do that in this situation? Thankfully, we are now getting more vaccinations, and we hopefully will be able to get out of the cocoons. But we should reach out. We should try to find out who are our neighbors and how are they doing. Do they have that? There are, I know in California, the government has organized a volunteer program, which is mainly aimed at vaccination, but there are volunteer ways we can reach out to help. I'm sure you've probably thought about and have some great ideas, and others of you do too. So if we put all our ideas together, I think we'll come up with some good solutions.
Thanks for that. Thank you very much.
Dr. Davis, thank you very much for being with us today, for your time. And I know that you have a class to run to. Thank you again for...
Well, actually, my student is taking the day off because of the Easter holiday coming up. So I'm going to stay on a little bit longer and listen to Sophia and some others of you. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Erin?
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Sophia Blyth. She's a researcher from the University of Birmingham, and her current research is in is looking at the implementation of the UK's counter-terrorism strategy in higher education. This is sounds particularly interesting to me as a politics student who specialises in security studies at one of the UK's higher education institutions. But today, Professor Blyth will be talking to us about our conference topic, COVID-19 and transformative perspectives. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. So do I, does Brent need to exit, or do
I need to stop. Yes, I need to stop. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me try this. It's also my first time using Google Meet. So let's see. A window. Oh, okay. This is doable. I think. Do you see that? Do you see my screen?
Yes. It's just, yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. Thank you. So if I start, is it still sharing? You can still see, yes?
Yeah, it's large and clear. So excellent.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So first of all, thank you to the organising committee of the London International Conferences for this invitation to deliver a keynote. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the honour. I thought I'd take the title of the conference itself as the title of my presentation. So COVID-19 and Transformative Perspectives, looking at the kinds of challenges that we're experiencing within the higher education sector and how we might implement various perspectives to try to overcome the challenges that we're experiencing. So to start off with, I'll share with you some statistical information about the impact that the global pandemic has had on the education sector, both in the UK, but also in other parts of the world. I'll then move on to outlining the key challenges that have been the main challenges that have been experienced by the key stakeholders, namely the educational institutions themselves, the practitioners, the professors, the lecturers, the teachers, and arguably the most important stakeholders within the education sector, and that is the learners, the students. So what kinds of challenges have come about as a result of the pandemic? What sort of solutions could we potentially offer, and specifically reminding ourselves and refreshing our memories about what transformative learning theory is and how it could be implemented in the case of the pandemic and within educational establishments. So let's begin then with some statistical information about COVID-19 and the education sector. According to the World Economic Forum, last year, towards the end of last year, they published a report in which they said that a staggering 1.2 billion children across 186 countries have been directly impacted by the global pandemic. Now, this direct impact has been in the form of not having access to their place of study, so their educational establishment, or not having the necessary resources, whether this is hardware or software, so whether it's their laptops or computers, even something that we may take for granted, which is broadband connections, or people competing within the home, competing in the sense that there are competing needs. So if there's more than one child within the home who needs to be online at the same time to learn and to have to take an online class, they've been affected because there's only one computer in the home, or there's limited resources, etc. in that way. So 1.2 billion children across 186 countries. So more than 2/3 of the world's kids have been affected in this way. In the UK, 65% of students reported having absolutely no face-to-face teaching between the months of March and December, and this was according to statistics by the Office for National Statistics at the end of last year. So this has been quite significant, because initially in the UK, higher education establishments were a little slow to close universities completely. There was a little bit of uncertainty, and it wasn't around the middle of last year that most universities decide to completely close, but 65% had none. Teachers expressed an urgent need for information and communication technology training, and this was according to the OECD. And of course, as soon as we moved to things like online learning and teaching, there became an urgent and a pressing and an immediate need for that training in some cases, because not everyone was fully IT conversant or competent, or may not have had a familiarity with the different platforms that are being utilized in the different educational settings. Also, what's been impacted is internationalization and student mobility, which is currently on indefinite hold, as reported by The Economist. And if we consider that internationalization is something that global educational institutions have been stressing and working towards quite extensively over the past decade in particular, for this to suddenly come to a halt, whether it's in the case of student mobility or staff exchanges and professors on educational trips and so on, for this to suddenly just come to a halt has been quite a dramatic change within particularly the higher education sector. I personally know of at least 5 or 6 people to whom this applies, both students and professors, where suddenly plans have come to a halt. And as a direct consequence of all of this, higher education institutions have faced crippling financial challenges. And if we take, for example, the case of postgraduate students here in the UK, if we look at the average cost, or at least the minimum cost of fees, international student fees for postgrads, the fees alone are normally in the range of, they start at around £20,000 a year for the fees alone. That excludes any accommodation costs, any cost of resources, and so on. And I know of degree courses where the cost of per year is £40,000 per year. Now multiply that by the number of international students within the country, making up something like 12% of the higher education sector, and the implications of this for the universities and indeed for the country are huge. So this was reported on by Deloitte in a report just a couple of months ago. Now, as far as the challenges for the education sector are concerned, these broadly speaking, fall into three main categories of the three main stakeholders. That's the educational institutions themselves, the practitioners delivering the alternative forms of education, and the students. So for educational institutions, they've got to remain mindful of stakeholder needs and the challenges that now accompany them in the new normal within this global pandemic and the educational settings. And those needs, the initial needs haven't changed. I mean, if we think about it, arguably, the education sector exists primarily, if not exclusively, for the purpose of students, to deliver to students. And those students' needs are still the same. Those stakeholder needs are still the same, but now we have educational institutions have additional challenges to contend with. In addition, we're also looking at things like the impact of the decisions taken. At what point do they decide to make radical changes to the programs, to the way in which the delivery is operationalized, or whether they move towards a hybrid learning situation, or something that's different to that. There are also campus and program-wide changes, on a practical level. For instance, take something like signage. I know of a very dear friend, who's at North Carolina State University in the US, and she told me about how her university had been very diligent in preparing for a return to education in September of last year. And they'd just on signage alone, signage instructing students to maintain social distance, to wash hands regularly, to use hand sanitizers across the campus. Just the signage for this alone had cost in the millions. But when the students arrived, shortly after their arrival, they had held a number of parties, and there was a huge outbreak across the university, resulting in the university being closed. Again, another university to which I'm affiliated in Finland and have been affiliated for more than 15 years, they had a similar situation where within the first 2 weeks of term starting, students held a number of parties, and 40% of the student population contracted COVID, and naturally the university had to close. So the implications of this on the preparations that the university had made to open up again, to provide a safe learning environment, those plans were completely scuppered, The educational institutions have to be mindful of what their competitors are doing, what other educational establishments are doing, because whether we like it or not, the education sector is certainly a business now, and there are implications for the decisions that are taken. The timing is important too, because to a very large extent, the decisions are informed by information that is shared by the government, by the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, about whether it's vaccines, what the infection rates are, and so on. So the timing, they have to constantly be on alert, the educational institutions, to ensure that they act in a timely fashion at the appropriate time. Practitioners, arguably, I think you'll all agree with me that the most pressing concern that practitioners had as soon as the pandemic struck was to either very swiftly achieve and acquire IT literacy and competence, or to refresh their IT literacy, to become, to come up to speed with the different IT requirements. Then, of course, there's in relation to and closely associated with this is their dependence on virtual learning environments and the degree of competence and also the access to this. So, for example, whether we're using something like Moodle or Canvas or WebCT or Blackboard or My Courses, whichever virtual learning environment our institutions use. And in some cases, for some of us, we're affiliated to multiple educational institutions, and they may be using different virtual learning environments. So, at one institution, I might have to be competent in and familiar with Blackboard, and in another, I might be having to use My Courses, and in another, it may be WebCT. And in each of these cases, the practitioners have to know how to build and use their, construct the courses so that they put the relevant information up there for their students. And coupled with all of this is the inescapable fact of ensuring that the pedagogical approach taken within the classroom, the virtual classroom, is one that is appropriate for and adapted to the needs of, to deliver the learning outcomes, to ensure that the objectives are met and that the students are able to take away as much as possible as they would do perhaps otherwise in a face-to-face setting. For students, their challenges are slightly different. They have to hop between synchronous and asynchronous learning. Is this the new norm? There's the intermittent opening of institutions. I know students, for example, who have prepared on several occasions to supposedly return back to the campus. We're opening next term, we're opening next month, we're opening after the half term. And of course, this has changed because the educational institutions have had to follow the information and the advice that's given by the governments, by the pharmaceutical industry, by the medical industry, as in relation to the degree of infections and so on. There's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress surrounding exams and assessments. Inevitably, due to social distancing rules, the exams can't take place in the usual way. Now, I know a lot of students who in the first instance were quite excited by this and felt that, this is great, I don't have to take an exam. But this very quickly changed into a position of stress and anxiety, because now it meant that there was more subjectivity involved, where the awards or the results given to the students were not only based on their mock exam results that they may have done in the past, but their teachers' assessment of what they predict that the students would have got should they have taken the exam, and so on. So there's a larger emphasis on subjectivity here, which created a lot of stress has created a lot of stress for many students. There's also the practical implications of things like the cancellation of placements. I mean, for example, in my own case, my son's case, my son is completing his master's degree at the moment, and when he selected his master's program, he had about 5 or 6 degrees to choose from, and he opted for one which had a 6-month practical placement after his intensive year of theoretical input on the degree program. Well, only weeks before he was due to start, that was cancelled, and so that completely scuppered his plans. And of course, this applies in the case of medical students and law students and engineers and so many other disciplines where there has been the cancellation of practicals and placements, which has had an impact on the learning experience. And this all, in turn, inevitably affects levels of motivation and discipline. Students have also been deprived of peer learning, and there's a lot to be gained from learning from colleagues and from others within the classroom. So that's not the same on a virtual learning platform. And we might assume that students are naturally, given their age, given the generation, the time within which they've been raised, that they may be IT competent, but that's not necessarily actually a given. A lot of students also struggle with or have difficulties with IT literacy or competence across the whole portfolio of IT facilities that are typically utilized in the learning process. And then there's access to resources that we've mentioned before, whether this is hardware, software, or broadband access. There's a question of online etiquette. I could share some horror stories with you of some of my personal experiences last year where students thought it was perfectly fine, say, for example, to start cooking a meal in the middle of the class and they've got the camera turned on. But perhaps the more horrific and shocking experience that I personally had was when 2 students were cuddled up in bed during a class. So, this sort of, forgetting that the camera's on, or do they turn the camera on or do they not? This whole online etiquette situation has been one that's been rather challenging for some. Students have been deprived, generally speaking, of the opportunity to pose one-to-one questions or tutorials with the practitioner on what would otherwise be a more frequent basis. So when the class ends, do you have any questions? There's a little pause, and if the questions don't flow immediately, and we know that generally they don't, well, the call is ended, and that's the end of that. And so that the opportunity is pretty much gone as well, unless they email the professors and so on. There's also a question of value for money. Typically speaking, virtual degrees or distance degrees have been slightly cheaper or less expensive, let's say, because they're not cheap, less expensive than face-to-face degrees. But during this pandemic, few educational establishments have actually made a difference. They've maintained the fee for the face-to-face learning and implemented that as far as online learning is concerned too. Then we have the physical, the health impacts like screen glare, impact on eyesight, and also mental health and loneliness. So what kinds of solutions? Well, the first solution that isn't rocket science is engaging in regular communication among and between stakeholders. So all the stakeholders that I've just mentioned, plus the broader stakeholders across the country. And if we take the theme of the conference, it's the application of transformative learning, which involves the psychological, the convictional, and behavioral stages, and combining these with the codes involved with, from sociolinguistic, psycholinguistic, and epistemic angle to try to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on education. So transformative learning theory is something that was put forward by Jack Mezirow in his book, Transformative Dimensions of Adult Learning in 1991. And he based this on a three-pronged approach that was premised on experiential learning involving the psychological angle, which emphasized the need for autonomous introspection and meaning-making, coupled with the convictional approach, which is experience-based and mentally cognitive shifts in beliefs and values or assumptions. So when faced with the new normal, we cannot just continue according to previous experiences. So we have to challenge those on the new experiences that we have. And this means changing our behavior and a willingness to change habits, lifestyles, and thinking as well. And in order to do this effectively, this involves effective meaning-making structures plus critical reflection. And within meaning structures, Mezirow referred to the three codes, which were sociolinguistic codes involved the language, the societal norms, and challenging cultural expectations. As far as the psycholinguistic is concerned, it's about the emotional state. So being aware of our own emotional state, our own mental well-being, but also importantly, as was just said also in Brent's talk just before mine, the importance of the community learning, community well-being, and community support. And then there's the epistemic code, which involves the application of knowledge, theory and knowledge into practice to try to deliver something that's valid, that's reliable, leading to conditions for true learning. And for all of this to be functional, it's important to engage in critical reflection, because this is a prerequisite for transformative learning and perspectives. And this means that all of us will need to challenge and have had to challenge our assumptions, our norms that we acquired in the past, in our childhoods, up to the present. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
I would have one question. Do you hear me?
I do hear you, and I'm just coming back to the main screen. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, you talked about the challenges for educational stakeholders.
Yes.
And based on this, do you also perceive some positive effects resulting from these challenges? For instance, that students have trained to work in a self-organized manner, or that, for instance, schools may have become more involved in the digital age? And do you think that what happens now in the educational sector shows us a picture about the school of the future? So how the school of the future might look like?
Thank you, Christina. It's a really interesting and really important and pertinent question. I think you're absolutely right. There have been positives as well as a result of this. And I think based on the kinds of examples that you've just given about the strength in how we've been able to adapt to some extent. You know, we've all been able to adapt within the education sector and also in the world, you know, the world of work. And we've seen, for example, that there is an awareness now that it's possible to work from home. It's not necessary to be on site. It's not necessary to be face to face. And I think there's also been an awareness that hybrid learning and hybrid working is potentially the new normal, and this has you know, positive impacts and can also have financial benefits for institutions, for example, educational institutions, if there are, I don't know, 3-day working weeks or 3 days schooling and educational weeks or something, you know. But yes, I think it's also been refreshing to see that some educational establishments have provided facilities for free to students and to staff, you know, where perhaps, for example, software has been made available, and there've been training sessions and so on. So yes, you're quite right. I agree with you. There have been. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not only about challenges. Certainly, there are plenty of positives to take away from this. I think the reason why I chose to focus on the challenges has been predominantly because we've all been thrown into this. It's an unprecedented situation in the in recent decades, and something that we hadn't foreseen. And so we didn't have a choice but to suddenly and immediately and urgently find solutions for this. And some have been able to do this more successfully than others. So thank you once again for your question. I'll be happy to take any other questions, or comments, if anybody else has any comments.
Well, that was a very thorough presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
As we are looking at these online education things, in sociocultural theory, Vygotsky, there's this idea that we learn through our social interactions, and these are perhaps not as strong in a virtual learning environment. Have you thought, I think you mentioned peer learning earlier in your question to me. So what ways can we improve peer learning in this virtual environment?
Thank you, Brent. It's a really important point. Yeah, I think the thing with Vygotsky's theories and so on is that these came about at a time, of course, when virtual learning wasn't part of the equation, and so the primary focus of the theories then was on the shared and on the cognitive development theory, and learning at the different stages and the different levels of cognitive development and the different kind of learning that could be acquired through peer learning. I think what we can do in the current climate to try to take on, kind of marry the two, sort of Vygotsky's theories with the challenges that we experience today, is to modify our pedagogies to try to encompass situations and provision, facilities where, for example, group projects. To give you an example, I was teaching in Finland, but online for the first time in 15 years. And with my degree students, I created an online project that they had to engage in. And that project had several different components, presentation, research-based, outputs, etc., etc. So they had to demonstrate, well, first of all, they had to ensure that they worked and created their own timetable. They had to be disciplined. They had to work outside of the online classroom lecture format, to work in groups. So they had to, whether this was face-to-face or whether it was virtually, and in most cases it was virtually because it's an international program. So they had to organize their time and to make sure that they delivered, they met the deliverables for the project that was set. And then they'd, of course, come to the class, and there would be the online class, and there would be the opportunity to co-present and so on. So I think it's about modifying the pedagogies. That's what we can do to facilitate peer learning, where if there are various activities that necessitate interacting with others, it's not a question of it would be beneficial, but it's required. And under those circumstances, we provide them with a platform, with a base upon which they can continue that peer learning, to get the benefits from peer learning. Thank you.
Hi, Miss Sophia. I'm Elsa from Indonesia. I think I want to share about the condition in Indonesia, because actually this condition, the pandemic condition in Indonesian education, there are some difficult for rural area in Indonesia, especially in Kalimantan, and then Papua, and then other countries. Indonesia has several islands. So actually, I want to share to you all about the condition in Indonesia. So in West Kalimantan, there is the condition that the teacher should take the book to the student and take the book again from the student. Because what? Because there is no signal in there, so it is difficult for us to have the good education. So what do you think about it? Because we can share about the condition, real condition about the education in Indonesia. So it is not about the town, yeah. It is about the rural country in Indonesia, because so many rural country in Indonesia.
Yeah.
So what do you think about it?
Thank you for that question, Elsa. I'm really pleased that you've raised this, because I focus predominantly on the developed countries and the kinds of challenges that when we're looking at IT and access and resources. But there is this very real and very pressing every day, not even just because of COVID, not only because of the pandemic, but it's an ever-present challenge. And it's a really important point that you raise, yes. And again, I think it's to do with looking at alternative solutions and alternative methods, whether this means, for example, communities coming together and creating their own support bubbles, for instance, where there could be, say, for example, pooling of finances to get one book in one community, but they come together to learn, and and that way they can share. So there's I know that, for example, in some rural communities in Africa, the students have become champions. The young, even people as young as 12 or 14 or something, and they're the star students in the class who have been able to have been able to tutor their peers in that sense. So they've taken on board the making copious notes and diligent notes from their teachers, and then communicating this to their peers through smaller group, community group activities. So I think these are the kinds of things, somehow relying on or calling upon charities to donate facilities and resources that can be used, if not one per student, and certainly one per rural pockets of rural communities, for example. I think practically I think you're quite right in pointing out that there are very real present practical challenges, just on an absolutely basic level, whether it's, you know, about having pencils and paper and boards to write on and chalk and, you know, these and books. Yes, absolutely. I think you're quite right. And this is where, you know, calling upon international charities, for instance, and also at the same time within the communities, for the communities, you know, the altruism to come about and take force. That's important. That's very important. I think, yeah, one of the things that this pandemic has certainly brought to the fore for many of us is the need to move away from the individualism that we've been so engrossed in over the past few decades. You know, it's all been about, you know, this, you know, it's about striving to try and get the best for me and the best for, you know, this kind of thing. And this has taught us that we can't do this. This pandemic has really taught us that we cannot do this, because the implications for society are much, much broader when you have individuals who are suffering, and then you've got whole communities that are affected by this. This has a wider impact on the rest of the country and the world and so on. So, yeah, we have to move away from the individualist to the community way, and looking at supporting each other.
Yeah, in Indonesia, the name is gotong royong, you know. So actually, in West Kalimantan that I know, they built one house from wood for the students. Several students, about 5 until 7 students, stay at the house to take the book from the teacher and learn together there.
Yeah, so like a rota perhaps also, you know, where the book is, that's great. Yes, practical solutions, right? That's a very, thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin.
For your talk and all the questions. We're going to take a break now, and then rejoin, or you can stay online, but perhaps turn off your cameras, get a cup of tea or something to rejoin for the second session, which will start at 3:50.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.